Welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 172, season 4, episode 12, the last in the book of Genesis. Typically speaking, over the last 3 years, when we have come to a completion of a work, of a text, of a book, it's a moment for celebration because we've done something. We spent a good number of weeks together, we've learned together, we've studied together, we've grown together. And in that space, it makes sense to take a couple of minutes to celebrate that accomplishment. For me this year, it's actually quite different. The sense that the completion of the book of Genesis this year is a solemn reminder of how many weeks we have been at war and how many weeks all the hostages have not been home and how many weeks, how many soldiers, and how many people we have lost. And so it's been 12 weeks. 13 weeks, really. 13 weeks. And that's a long time. We don't think of it that way because we're living it day to day, week to week. And we don't usually see it in the block of time that it actually is. But this started on October 7th. It's now the 29th day of December. Do the math on that. It's a lot of days. It's a lot of days. And we're reminded of it constantly, and we should be consistently, because it should be top of mind, it should be top of heart, it should be right there in our throat when we think and we speak and we live and we talk and we move around and we try to be. So it is a bit of a solemn kind of moment, as much as it is a celebratory moment, because it is the fourth time that we together are completing the book of Genesis. In that time, we've covered a whole host of subjects, all kinds of different subjects around leadership and success and coaching related. And so one more. This week's topic is on seeding the future. It sounds similar to last year, when last year I focused on predicting success, but last year very much focused on leading and lagging indicators, and this year I'm going to go in a very different direction with it. I want to sort of pull out some maybe wider themes that are happening in this week's portion. In this week's portion, Jacob passes away. Jacob blesses both his sons and his two grandsons. Joseph passes away at the end. And so there is that sense of closure in the work, obviously, around that, in the sense that we're moving from family into nation, because as the book of Exodus opens next week, the people have changed. They've grown dramatically in terms of number and size and scope. And so it's a different feel when Exodus begins next week. And so what I wanted to sort of think about here with you this week is an idea about how we think about preparing ourselves and our people for the future. How do we seed the future as a leader, right? So this is more typical of our Coaching with the Bible themes and structures. And I think when you see it, it becomes very clear. What Jacob is trying to do is seed the future, not just in terms of the actions that he is performing and executing with respect to his children and his grandchildren, but sort of the more subtle kinds of ideas about what he's trying to get it done at the same time. And so let's pick up on a couple. The first thing to pick up on is when he's blessing, at first, his two grandsons. The blessing of his two grandsons is a very powerful moment in the Bible, because it's really the first time that happens. Right? We know that Isaac is alive when Jacob's children are born and existing. We know that that's the case because we know the reunion takes place in the Bible, that Jacob comes back to the house of Isaac. But there's no interaction there between Isaac and his grandsons. We know that Abraham is alive when Jacob and Esau are born, but there's no interaction, at least not in the text that we're aware of, between them at all. And so here you have a moment where Jacob is coming together in a meeting with his two grandsons, the two sons of Joseph, right, Manasseh and Ephraim, and he's going to bless them. It's a very meaningful, I think, moment. It is also ultimately the text that we use for the custom of blessing our children on Friday nights as the Sabbath comes in. And so it's based in there. And so one of the things I think that's really important to appreciate, to pluck out of there as you're trying to see the future for people, is to appreciate a couple of things. One, there is no necessarily important in value per se in what a person accomplishes in life based on where they're born in the family. I think that's a very powerful point. So point number one is if you're the oldest or the youngest or the middle, it really has no bearing really ultimately on who you're going to be and what you're going to accomplish in this world. Menashe is the older of the two. Ephraim is the younger, and that's the one that Jacob puts first. Joseph tries to fix it. Jacob doesn't allow, and Jacob is saying to him, look, the reality of the world is that, and the truth is that that's been the seed all the way through here, is we have to appreciate potential greatness from wherever it comes. And we also have to accept the idea that people in our families and people that are around us potentially could end up being greater than we are, and we have to be good with that. We have to accept that. We also have to help it to happen. We'll talk more about that in just a couple of moments. And so the fact that Ephraim, according to Jacob, is going to be greater, or that his descendants are going to be greater, shouldn't diminish the other son. It shouldn't diminish the accomplishments of that child. Each one should be cheered. Related to that point, there's no sense of jealousy that comes between those two boys. It's one of the commentaries that come up as to why we use the texts around them as the source for blessing our children, is because it should be that there is only appreciation and encouragement and cheering from sibling to sibling in a family, and not sense of jealousy or even worse, hatred that could show up. And so the fact that Ephraim and Manasseh are sort of equal, even though they're different and they have different roles to play, and their relationships with their father and their grandfather perhaps are different, it doesn't matter. And so that's the first very key thing. Like fundamentally at its core is that if we're not cheering for these people, then effectively we're booing them. And if we're not cheering these people, then we're not helping them. And then ultimately they're not getting to the highest level of success. And so I think Jacob right away is really putting that in there. And I think he's, on some level, if you wanted to say that he's justifying sort of how it went down with Joseph many years before, fine. But what Jacob is at least minimally saying is that the way it played out with the hatred and the jealousy between Joseph and his brothers is not optimal and does not have to be the case. It can be fixed, it can be different. I think that's first, very important kind of an idea. The second thing I think that Jacob is enforcing is staying true to the true north. The true north is the idea of returning back to the land, reestablishing the family and the nation in its homeland, and that's going to happen. And he symbolizes that by the fact that he is requiring of them and obligating them to bring him back and to bury him there in the land. Same thing that Joseph does at the end of the text is the same idea of seeding the sense that there is a North Star, there is a destiny, there is a future, and that future is not here in Egypt, that future is back at home in the homeland, in the land of Israel. And it's important to sort of have those things. So on one level with Jacob is this very communal, familial relationship building factor that's very important. We're trying to build a team. All those things are very important. We talked about it before. We were talking about norming and storming and performing as sort of the basics as to how you team build. And so Jacob is very much in that space when he's handling Ephraim and Manasseh in that moment. Joseph, too, as the father watching this. And then the second thing is this idea of a North Star. The third thing that I think is really important here is, and we won't go so deep into it here, but when Jacob blesses his sons, so it's not just a blessing for the children in the room, this is sort of for all time. And what he's establishing, and this is really important, I was reading an article earlier about self-awareness, is that what Jacob is picking up on is sort of the fundamental character traits of each and every one of the tribes. They are united, but they're not uniform. What I mean by that is there's a reason there are 12. So they come at it from different perspectives, they have different character traits, they have different strengths and different weaknesses, and they're supposed to act in a complementary and also supplementary manner in the way that good teams should go. And so when he's blessing them, he's picking up on their strengths and their weaknesses, and he's pointing them out to everybody else in the room. It's not to embarrass, it's not to diminish, and it's not to demean. It might be some level of rebuke, that's for sure. But the intent here is to say, hey, Reuben, look, you're good at this, and you were good at this, but you were not good here, here, and here. But don't worry about it. You have 11 brothers who are going to come in and play the role of complement to you and the team to make the team whole and complete, and therefore ultimately more likely to succeed in the future. So he's seeding the future by explaining what the reality of it is with respect to the family. It's important that they sort of appreciate all the things that are going on there at the same time, right? And so when they come together, that's how it starts to form that team. And so that's how you start to get the trust, and that's how you start to get sort of, working together. Again, keep in mind, obviously this has been years and years and years in the making, this meeting, but they started off pretty rough earlier on. And even though Joseph has forgiven them and has moved on, not clear that they have exactly done the same thing. But they're all in the room together, which is important. So what Jacob is doing is he's pinpointing holes in each one of the players. And by establishing the fact that Benjamin is great at this and Joseph has this, that they can each work together to make something greater. One of the things that comes out in the text that's really interesting is later on, after all the blessings are done, the Bible mentions that Jacob blessed them each to their own blessing, right? And so I don't remember the verse exactly, right? But basically the idea is, well, we know he's blessed them already, so why are you telling us now that he's blessed them each according to their own blessing? And so the commentaries all say, because what they realize is that for their own strengths, they can get some from their brothers as well. And from their weaknesses, they can pick up pieces from everybody else around them. So instead of trying to turn all of their sixes into tens, they can acknowledge that there is 6 in this, and they can complement with a brother who's a 9, and they can work together to get there. That each one has complementary and supplementary pieces to the strengths that is. So let's say, one of the brothers is uber kind. That's his strength. He's a very kind person, right? So his kindness might actually be, on some level, a weakness because it might lead to naivete. So he might be super naive. But don't worry, he has a brother who is really self-aware and is also very much street smart, and paying attention to what's going on around them. And they are then complementing each other, and one is picking up some of those pieces from somebody else in the family to mesh that fiber even tighter than it might have been before. And so what Jacob is doing is that he's building a great team. To use a great quote from one of the great coaches of all time, Phil Jackson, the strength of the team is each individual member. The strength of each member is the team. And so what happens is that you can't have 12 superstars. It just doesn't work that way. You always have superstars, you have people who step up in certain moments, and then you have role players. That's how teams are built. Find me the last team that was all superstars that was a championship level team. You get people who are role players. Just take the 12 tribes. In the Bible itself, you hear about Joseph's story. You hear some of Judah's story. You hear a story about Simon and Levi. And here and there you hear little snippets about Reuben. Right? There are a lot more brothers. Benjamin has a role to play in last week. But the other ones, you don't hear about them. Later on in the Bible, their descendants play a role. So you'll have, one of the judges is coming from a different tribe, and the king, the king is going to come from this tribe, whatever it is. But there are role players. And so Jacob is meshing and building and strengthening and communicating and connecting the future team of the people of Israel. And by pinpointing their strengths and their weaknesses, and by mentioning and saying, look, if you're not good here, here's a brother. He's here for you. He's in the room. Take him up on the opportunity to work together, to collaborate. Within the brother system, you see subsets of brothers that actually do work together, some for better and some for worse. But you get the Yisachar Zevulun relationship, which is one is studying and the other one is out in the business, out in business, and so they're collaborative. You have the sense of Judah and Benjamin are going to be in the land. They're going to be the seat at where Jerusalem is going to be. So the heart of the spiritual community is going to be right at the center of where they are. You'll have the two and a half tribes that are going to go together later on. Spoiler alert! Sometime in the book of Numbers, right, where they go and decide that they're going to settle on a certain side of the river, and so you do get sub pairings in the brothers. But at the same time, the collective unit is incredibly powerful, and Jacob bringing then in also the sons of Joseph into that mix even makes it stronger because they add new elements that simply their father and uncle's generation simply do not have. So what you have then is this sort of mix of things that Jacob is trying to do. First, again, is this sort of equality, no jealousy factor, appreciation of success and stardom, right? That's one. Two is the idea of that North Star approach, keeping in mind that there is a bigger fish to fry and that there's a big goal at the end of it. Three is this sense of meshing and tying the team together and creating the bonds that will be unbreakable as they go forward. It doesn't work otherwise. And then what you get here is the last one, which I think is super important, which is that comes up after Jacob has passed away. Jacob is no longer alive. He's been buried back in the land. And now it's the generation of the brothers. And the brothers are nervous. For 50 years or so, Joseph has held it together. He has constantly told them that this was God sending him forward. And maybe they believed him, maybe they didn't believe him, maybe they feigned believing. Maybe he feigned saying it, he didn't believe it either. And now it's this moment after Jacob is gone, and now this super powerful brother of theirs, what's he going to do? He could take it out on them. This is an opportunity. The father's no longer around. And so they come up with this sort of white lie that Jacob told them to tell Joseph that when the time came that he should forgive and let bygones be bygones and let it pass and not worry about it. Okay. And Joseph is sticking to his line, which is, I was sent, not sold, to use a term. And he continues that line, and he's going to take care of them. And so he reassures what it is that he has told them time after time after time, and he stuck with it. And why is this important? I think, one, it's an important factor when you're trying to seed the team for the future is the communication between the players on the team, that they're talking to each other, even in the case where they're not being totally forthright with each other. That's one. Two, there is a disagreement here, fundamental, as to how to resolve what effectively seems like an open wound. Their approach is to sort of cover it over. Come up with some sort of an explanation that sort of covers it over, which doesn't fix it, but allows it to go to the future. Joseph's approach is, no, that doesn't work. His approach is reinterpret it. He gives it a reframing, which I think I've seen in a couple of different sources and a couple of different books. He reframes what happened in the past as a sent, not a sold. That he was, the other term is that he was seated and he was not buried. And so what happened to him happened, and yes, they're responsible for it on some level, but it was the hand of God. And if you allow for the reframing of what happened, a lot of the guilt fades away. A lot of the distrust that might still sit there fades away. And the opportunity to really collectively come together and be whole is actually on the precipice of happening. And so Joseph says to his brothers, guys, we don't need this anymore. We don't have to cover up what was. What was. It's just a question of how you see it. Because what's going to be really important is as what comes next happens, is how you're going to see that. And so are you going to see slavery as X or Y or Z? Are you going to see the suffering as A or B or C? How are you going to prepare yourselves and the generations that follow for what's about to come to be ready for that to happen? So first and foremost, we need to communicate with each other. We need to be on the same page with each other. We need to, as we said before, complement each other, supplement each other, draw strength from each other. But we also have to have a very clear frame as to what is and what is not happening. And when you're able to do those things as a unit, as a body together, one hand talking to the other, one hand clapping with the other, and we build that trust together, then, and only then, you actually have something that actually works completely. And only at that point, then and only at that point do you actually create the team that's actually that's ultimately going to be successful. And so that's what's happening here in this last portion. It is setting up what's coming in the next story, but it's setting up with very key core principles that are across the board and across time as key and core principles for leadership, for growth, for success, and for seeing the end when that end is going to be there. That is how we close out the book here, Coaching with the Bible, for Genesis Volume 4, the fourth time through. And let's end, as always, Coaching with the Bible with a quote. Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. Looking forward very much to seeing you next week as we begin our path through Exodus. We bring back Moses, who we haven't talked about in a while. We start to really learn about what's going on there in Egypt, what that means, how that helps, how that hurts, what that does for the people, what that does for the nation, what that does for its leaders, and what that actually means for the rest of us. Let's hope and pray that the coming week brings us a whole lot of blessing, a whole lot of miracles. Those of you celebrating the coming new year, wish you a happy, healthy, and a blessed and successful new year. Let's hope for the best. That's Coaching with the Bible for this week.